this is a bit like the old days of the sort of Brezhnev Soviet Union back in the 1970s, just in fast forward, slow, shabby slide down into stagnation and such like. I think really we're all just waiting for that day when Putin doesn't wake up.
And this kind of hubris, you believe, may be the undoing, in a way, of Putin, in that he may overplay his hand in any upcoming meetings with Donald Trump. What is the fear amongst those close to him?
Yeah, the fear is that at the moment, Putin particularly is looking quite cocky. He's seeing his forces continue to slowly grind forward in Ukraine. He's seeing all sorts of divisions in the West. And there is that sense that a man who clearly enjoys mind games and petty exercises of power, remember, this is a man who kept the Pope waiting for an hour. This is a man who, again, as I mentioned in the article, knowing that former German Chancellor Angela Merkel was terrified of dogs, nonetheless, brought his great big Labrador into the room. This is really playground stuff, but nonetheless, clearly Putin gets a kick out of that. And the fear, and this is something I actually had from speaking to someone who back in the day had actually briefed Putin early in his presidential career, and was saying the thing about Putin nowadays is 25 years in power, he thinks he knows it all, he thinks it knows it better than everyone else, and that he may well not listen to his briefers and precisely try some kind of little petty one-upmanships with Trump, exactly the sort of thing that Trump would respond badly to. And the thing is that whereas the Biden administration was quite cautious, the sense is that if Trump turns against Russia, then all bets will be off.
And what do you think he's capable of if Trump does turn against Russia?
Well, again, I mean, there's what Trump's initial impulse would be, and there will be what, in some ways, the Pentagon and the rest of the machine would allow him to do. I mean, I think in practice, what we would just simply see is not just a lot more assistance being provided to Ukraine, but all the old limitations on how Ukraine could use these missiles and other systems taken away. So basically, more or less Trump egging on the Ukrainians to do their worst, but also sabotage. The Ukrainians carry out campaigns of sabotage. We might well find a lot of more CIA assistance for that.
So really what President Zelensky should be hoping for is that Putin does exactly that and overplays his hand with Donald Trump and annoys him so that he actually supports Ukraine more.
Yeah, and certainly that's something that we are getting now from various Ukrainian officials and commentators and so forth. There is that sense that although at first there was quite a lot of dismay about Trump's election in Kyiv, because Trump and Zelensky do not have a good relationship. And at the moment, the decision by the American administration to suddenly block all some non-military aid programs is clearly also having quite a serious impact in Ukraine itself. But nonetheless, there is that sense that whereas Biden stood for, in a way, slow, measured defeat, with Trump, it's much more of a, toss a coin. Heads we lose, tails we win, but basically there is a chance that, frankly, they didn't think, certainly in the last year or so, the Biden administration was giving them.
You mentioned earlier that after 25 years in power, President Putin may well not be listening to any of his aides anymore. And we've spoken before about the influence of his former security chief, Nikolai Patrushev, who is now his presidential aide. And I think you told me that he had this potentially strong influence during the COVID lockdown of pouring poison into his ear and influences his worldview. What's happened to him? And is there anybody, do you think, who has Putin's ear now?
There are people who have Putin's ear, but they're almost all much less visible because if you're a real Putin confidant, you don't bother going into government. You basically go into business, make sure that the state provides you with huge contracts or whatever, and become obscenely rich. Why bother going to the hassle of actually running anything? Patrushev really seems to be moving out of the president's inner circle. He's increasingly now being sort of trotted out to do lengthy radio or TV or newspaper interviews in which he lambasts the evil Anglo-Saxons, Brits and the Americans, for all our conspiratorial bad work and such like, which tends to be a sign of someone who's on the out but trying desperately to retain Putin's ear. This is the interesting thing at the moment, that actually it's very hard to sort of chart a geography of Putin's inner circle. There are people he gets on with. There are people he tells what to do. There doesn't seem to be anyone who kind of bridges the gap, who actually has policy relevance and experience and knowledge. And Patrushev for all that I frankly regarded him as about the most dangerous man in Russia, nonetheless did have, he was smart, he had experience. There aren't people like that who are still in his circle, which means that we are so much more dependent now on what Putin himself thinks and what people who have no real experience, but nonetheless might well have been the last person to talk to him on some particular topic, may well be advising him.
Do you think that in that light, then, he's becoming more isolated?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a classic pattern for dictators and autocrats over time. Their circle of people that they listen to and trust shrinks and shrinks. Their willingness to listen to alternative perspectives, someone who actually might say, it's not like that, diminishes. The tolerance simply for people who know what they're doing. I mean, we've seen this, for example, with Elvira Nabiullina, who is the chairwoman of the Russian Central Bank, phenomenally capable banker. In some ways, she's the one who should be getting all the medals, because that's, very much her work has allowed the Russian economy to remain as effective and stable as it has. But even Nabiullina now seems to be sort of out of favor. He's getting a bit snippy about her, simply because she can't wave a magic wand and bring down inflation the way he'd like it to be done. Increasingly, there is this sense of a man who no one can really question, who gives orders and expects those orders to come to pass, even when those orders actually are pretty much impossible to arrange. I mean, these are all the kind of classic signs of the sort of late stage, the senile stage of an authoritarian regime. And, it's one of the reasons why I think that although the Russian state still has a lot of capacity within it, Putin himself, I think, has outlived his capacities to evolve and, frankly, to manage this country.
So where do you see this going in the next, the ensuing 5 years or so?
Well, I mean, in terms of Putin, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think he's going anywhere. I mean, this is a system which is built really to ensure that there can be no real challenge to the leader. So many overlapping and competing security apparatuses that balance each other. Very hard to have a political coup against him. Likewise, incredibly hard for any kind of public organization, unless there's something really that starts to sort of shatter. Instead, this is a bit like the old days of the sort of Brezhnev's Soviet Union back in the 1970s, just in fast forward, slow, shabby slide down into stagnation and such like. I think really we're all just waiting for that day when Putin doesn't wake up. And that's where we're at.
And to return to the subject of where we're going with the war in Ukraine, can we just talk briefly about the position of President Xi of China? How much influence does he have over Putin? And where do his loyalties or interests lie when Donald Trump, for example, asks him to help stop Russia's war on Ukraine?
In some ways, I mean, firstly, if Xi really was given the opportunity to end the war by the Americans, that would actually be a really difficult dilemma for him. Because look, on the whole, China has its interests, Russia has its. I mean, at the moment, there is some kind of an alliance because they both feel that the current sort of Western-led global order does not really suit them, but it's a deeply pragmatic transactional one. The Russians know that they can't ultimately trust the Chinese. The Chinese are not going to go out of their way to support the Russians. This war is one that, frankly, the Chinese don't mind. I mean, I don't think it's that they see huge benefits, but it forces the Russians to be more and more dependent upon Beijing. It keeps the West distracted. But the chance to actually be the ones to end the war, to be the peace brokers, I mean, that would be a massive fillip for China. China has been trying to present itself, especially again in the global south, as the kind of the new, not just the new player on the global scene, but the grown-up player. I mean, they have used Ukraine as a way of saying, look, the Russians, the Americans, the Europeans, they're all busy fighting, they're all busy competing, they can't solve anything. All they're trying to do is put sanctions on you and drag them into their conflict. So I think that really might be quite a temptation. But that said, I don't think that Xi would want Putin to lose. He would want to broker some kind of peace that Putin can then take to his own people and say, look, we've sorted this out. And that's not necessarily what the West would want.
And also unlikely that Donald Trump would want President Xi to be the one to be seen who ended the war either.
Yeah, when it comes down to it, Trump, as ever, he throws out all sorts of potential ideas and talking points. But when it comes down to it, a major global event that does not have Trump center stage, I don't think that's really what he has in mind.
If we could just talk a little bit about the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi death camp Auschwitz, which was commemorated this week. Quite interesting to see what Vladimir Putin said on that day and his comments, because he was using it as an opportunity really to sort of put his slant on history. How do you see that as the way he's evolving his revisionist kind of stance on history?
Yes, well, obviously it ties in with this ludicrous idea that Ukraine is a neo-Nazi state. And therefore, the fact that Auschwitz was liberated by Soviet soldiers, which kind of has become elided into Russian soldiers, even though we must remember that those Soviet soldiers also included a lot of Belarusians and a lot of Ukrainians, as well as all the other nationalities of the USSR. But nonetheless, the fact that Russia was not present and that Soviet symbols were not shown in a death camp which was liberated by Soviet soldiers allows him to do two things. One is just basically play the victim. Why are the sacrifices of all of our compatriots to save the world from Nazism being sort of ignored and excluded and such like? And secondly, to again make this point of, when it comes down to it, we are the ones who are fighting Nazis. And isn't it a shame that the West is celebrating the liberation of Auschwitz, but nonetheless supporting the neo-Nazis of Ukraine? And I don't think he expects this to have any real traction in the West, but it still does have traction at home. I mean, the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, the Second World War, is still something that genuinely unites so many Russians. And therefore, everything that he gets a chance to not just say, remember our glories, but the West is denying them, that's a good propaganda line for him.
And just finally, Mark, you write about the fragile relationship between Trump and Putin. And to return to the title of your article in the Times, how will it change the world?
Well, precisely, I think we have to recognise that we're entering a world in which I think all the old assumptions about that the baseline was the etiquette of the liberal world order, in which things would be sorted out consensually through discussion and through multinational bodies and UN resolutions and all that. Frankly, it was already fraying very, very substantially. But now I think, Trump is actually going to just rip right through what's left. And look, it doesn't mean to say that we're entering into some kind of dog-eat-dog world of anarchy, because as I said, we can, as individual nations, as alliances and so forth, still choose to decide how we interact with each other. But these kind of platitudes about the way the world works, that for so long, particularly Western democratic, European democratic governments tended to trot out, and pretty much everyone realized was a bit of an old imagined order. I think we have to recognize that doesn't exist. And if there's going to be a new world order, we actually have to build it.
Mark Galeotti, great to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.